Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to this Schools History Project Understanding, SHP Understanding webinar series Framing US History. And this is our final of the 3 webinars that we put on. Once again, my name's Alex Ford and I'm joined again by Leandra Neffin. The big theme we're going into today is all about taking us on from where we've been before, thinking about 19th century US history and reframing that history. And last time we talked a lot about survivance and persistence of native identity post 1890, and today we're moving that on a little bit further. Before we do that though, I just wanted to come back to this image, which I'm sure lots of you will have seen either in textbooks or you'll have come across it before. It's called American Progress by John Gast, and it was painted in 1872 at the end or the beginning of the end of an era of US expansive colonialism. And I'm always struck by this image because it was painted with a very particular purpose. And I wanted to think about what the artist maybe wanted you to see when he painted this image. You might want to have a little think about that yourselves just for a second now. But one of the things that always strikes me about this image is that it goes back to that view of US history, which we talked about in the first week, that was this incredibly positive view of the kind of colonial project. And I think lots of the ways that people talk about US history, today, people kind of get nervous when you talk about the US as being a colonial state. But actually, in the 1870s, it was definitely seen as a colonial project, expansion and that move out across the continent. And I think the artist here clearly wanted you to see that as a great positive thing. So we've got Columbia here carrying technology, being followed by the railroads, carrying the school book in her arms, coming away from the East Coast and the trade and the commerce there, and moving out into this kind of what Gast wants you to see as an untamed wilderness, bringing light and civilization, all those things. But I also wanted to ask you, maybe as a recap, what you see now, either from your studies already of 19th century US history, but also maybe some of the things we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. How might you read that picture now? And I think there's lots in this picture that speaks to the history we've covered here. So I see a lot here on the right hand side to do with capital and profits, which drove expansionism and that colonial project. I see the displacement of indigenous peoples and Native Americans especially being moved out here, literally forced out before the colonists coming over. You see the environmental catastrophe that we know was the near extermination of buffalo on the plains, for example, and all the horrendous impact that had. We also see the attempted assimilation of Native Americans through the use of residential schools, which we talked about briefly last time, we'll touch on again today. And also, I think we see this idea that this is a project in which these colonists are complicit. So it's not that they're unknowingly going out into this land thinking it's empty somehow. There is a clear knowledge of what's happening here and the processes that are going underway, and that land theft happening down here with the farmers. But also, and I think this is one that maybe I hadn't seen in this image until quite recently, I also see a continuation, and I see survivance, and I see native peoples continuing to exist in this image too. So I think that's an image I want to come back to, and I know when Leandra talks to you a little bit later, she'll come back to this image as well. The big theme for today's session is all about continued pasts, continuing existence, and it continues on that theme of resistance and survivance, but also we are thinking about how and why indigenous peoples in North America are continuing to resist settler colonialism. And it goes back to this idea of framing again. So in that traditional narrative we looked at back in week 1, we said that there were some real problems when people perceived that there was no continued indigenous presence in North America, i.e. that indigenous peoples had disappeared or been assimilated completely, and that was false and needed changing. But also there's this kind of view as well, there's maybe a disconnect between the past and present, i.e. contemporary issues for Native Americans are not connected to the 19th century past, that somehow the 19th century history is finished and done, and whatever's happening now is a completely separate entity. And that actually is a really problematic thing as well. So that story needs reframing. And one of the things that we're aiming to do with this session is talk about some of the contemporary issues faced by Native Americans, and thinking about how if we really want to understand the present and do justice to history, we need to be aware both of contemporary issues and how those issues are deeply rooted in a colonial past, in the past of US expansion and colonialism. And I want to draw on one of my favourite historians, Marc Bloch, and Marc Bloch was writing as a Jewish historian in occupied France in 1944, and he talks about this idea that misunderstanding the present is an inevitable consequence of the ignorance of the past. I think we're all we know that sentiment, but he also says that a person might wear themselves out just as fruitlessly in seeking to understand the past if they're totally ignorant of the present. I.e., if we really want to understand a place, we need to understand its present as well as what happened in its past, and that's what we want to do today. Now, whilst we do this, and I'm going to hand over to Leandra for most of today's session, I do want to flag up that we are going to deal with some potentially upsetting issues, nothing graphic, but equally I just want you to be aware of those. So we will be talking a bit about residential schools. We will be talking about sexual abuse and missing and murdered women. So just to be aware that those things are coming up. And if you don't feel comfortable with that, clearly, please feel free to log off or have a word with the teacher or whatever else. But just wanted you to be aware before we move on. OK, so there are lots of issues we could focus on, I think, as we go through and think about contemporary issues for Native American peoples. We could focus on issues to do with pipelines. We could focus on issues to do with land claims. We could look at what's happening at Mount Rushmore. We could look at casinos. But what I really want to do here is think about one particular issue. And all of these pictures that you just saw on your screen relate to missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that is a crisis which has really deep historic roots. And it's one which I know Leandra is now going to come and talk to us about. So before I do that, I just want to tell you a little bit more about Leandra's expertise in this area, because that's part of the reason she's obviously contributed to the previous sessions, but I really wanted her on board for this one as well. So Leandra Neffen is an enrolled member of the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, with lineal descent from the Ponca tribe of Nebraska. And she's a trauma-focused cognitive behavioural psychotherapist. And she spent the last 5 years working with survivors of sexual violence and domestic abuse. So clearly this is an area she has great expertise in. She's an international public speaker, an advocate for Indigenous human rights, and with a particular focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls and people. Leandra is a board member for Intergenerational UK, Beyond the Spectacle, Native North American Presidents in Britain, which is a fantastic group and you should definitely go and check out. She's also part of the Omaha Tribal Historical Research Project and is on a panel of experts with the International Commission on Missing Persons at The Hague. So I can't think of anybody better really to take us through and talk to us about the historical roots of the MMIW crisis. So without further ado, and I will hopefully hand you over now to Leandra. Leandra.
Thank you, Alex. Uda watambade, umaha wa ubadi, umaha ijaje wiwitate, ambadagadi, wache ijaje wiwitate, Leandra, istashende wa ubadi. So it's good to see everybody here today. I'm glad you were able to join us. My Omaha name is Umbadagadi, which means a beautiful day is coming. My wache, or my white name, is Leandra, and I'm a ThunderClan woman. I belong to the Sky people. So today I'm just going to talk about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So this is a broad issue, so I'll probably be speaking quite quickly to get through a lot of the information. So what I speak to you about today is just a broad overview, basically scratching the surface of this issue. So missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or MMIWG, affects Indigenous peoples throughout Canada, the United States, and South America. This has resulted in a mass grassroots movement led by our women to raise awareness of this crisis that is impacting our communities. So it deserves to be stated that violence against Indigenous women and girls is not exclusive to North America. It's a worldwide assault that happens amongst many Indigenous communities throughout the world. But firstly, I want to acknowledge that while today we are centering the discussion on MMIWG, this is in no way diminishing the plight of our missing and murdered Native men, LGBTQ, and Two-Spirit relatives. So I put some hashtags there if anybody wants to check out any more information on this, you can do so. So just a bit of a background on MMIW. The missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic is an issue that currently affects Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, including First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. And it's been described as a crisis and a genocide that can be linked back to colonization, patriarchy, and assimilationist policies that were enacted through the Indigenous boarding or residential schools. Red is this official color of the hashtag MMIW campaign, but the color red actually has a deeper significant cultural value that's attached to it. For many tribes, red, or the color red, is known to be the only color that the spirits see. So it's hoped that by wearing red, we can call back the missing spirits of our women and children so we can lay them to rest. There's also the image of the red handprint that you can see here over the face. Sometimes people will use a black handprint in relation to oil pipelines, but it's really to signify the voices of these women that have been silenced. The Red Dress Project is also has become a symbol for MMIW. These dresses hang with a purpose. They're part of an ongoing art series titled The Red Dress Project by artist Jamie Black, which highlights the epidemic of violence against Indigenous women, and each dress symbolizes an Indigenous woman who has been murdered or is missing. So the dresses travel from place to place to raise awareness of this issue. On May 5th is known as the National Day of Awareness of Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls. This was a congressional resolution to designate May 5th as a National Awareness Day. So on this day, you'll probably notice throughout social media campaigns that there are a lot of photos that are kind of blasting social media with hashtags of MMIW, wearing red, a lot of community events, prayer circles, and vigils. Along with a list or even sharing sisters or relatives who've gone missing or murdered from the communities to kind of create a living memorial. But this is tied to actually what we'll talk to later, an incident that happened in relation to MMIW. So the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center actually states that the high rates of violence against Native women and the lack of accountability for this violence is really clearly tied to federal intrusion, vulnerabilities that resulted from this intrusion, and then the failure to exercise authority to prosecute perpetrators for the last 500 years. With European colonization came intergenerational trauma, and as a direct result, MMIWG. So from the time of European contact, Indian nations, they engaged with foreign governments as sovereign nations, but with colonization came that diminishment of our nations, which held these reciprocal relationships with the land and water. And the diminishment of these relationships due to settler supremacy put us in this position of dependency through the extraction of resources and land dispossession. So while violence against Native women is committed by individuals, it's really the federal policies, the federal colonial policies and laws that created the social setting for these crimes to occur. And it just really highlights the worldview of the colonized versus the colonizer, as being fundamentally distinct. So understanding the impact of colonialism and the ripple effect of trauma on Native women is essential to creating necessary reforms to address this crisis, because current federal law is based on laws and policies of an earlier time of US colonization. And those policies continue to govern, and they're targeted. They're targeted genocidal policies that target Indigenous peoples, and they create this ripple effect of intergenerational trauma, as you can see here. And I really like this quote by Resmaa Menakem, a trauma expert, that trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family looks like family traits, but trauma in a people looks like culture. So again, really quickly, just briefly, Manifest Destiny, which Alex discussed, was underpinned by the Doctrine of Discovery, which provided the framework for Christian explorers to lay claim to territories in the name of their sovereign, and the lands would be defined as discovered. So then they would set about Christianizing the Indigenous populations. So Kill the Indian, Save the Man. This was a slogan I think that Alex introduced to you in perhaps the previous sessions in relation to the boarding schools. So during the 19th century, the United States federal government was this paternalistic force against American Indians, and they created reservations, education systems, and treaties in the name of civilizing the natives and supposedly promoting their best interest. So the federal government even would refer to themselves as the Great Father, which implied this kind of paternalistic position of looking after the American Indians or being responsible for them. But for me personally, any slogan that starts with "kill the Indian" is going to lead to a crime scene. As a part of that assimilation process, many of our people were sent to boarding schools to try and kill the Indian and save the man. This was in line with, again, genocidal legislation to remove them or disconnect us from our lands, from our cultural ways, from our ceremonies. So Indigenous children were sent to be acculturated into a Eurocentric way of living, where Native families were coerced by the government and Catholic Church into sending their children to live and attend classes at a boarding school, which were often located far from their homelands. And arriving students would have their hair cut short in a military-style haircut. English Christian names would be assigned. Their traditional clothing would be replaced, diets changed, and unfamiliar concepts of space and time would be enforced. And they would be forever forbidden from speaking their native tongue and would be severely beaten if they did so. They would also be forced to let go of cultural gender roles in favor of a white patriarchal construct. So for instance, Native women, they traditionally held important political, economic, and social power within our communities. But with Christianity, it brought gender binary, which placed our women in these positions of subjugation. So our people had recognized gender fluidity and recognized our two-spirit relatives as sacred teachers and healers in the community. So to be gay, lesbian, gender non-conforming, non-binary, or trans was considered a blessing for Native nations. Two-spirit is a term that people use to describe Indigenous people who fulfill that third traditional gender role or gender variant. And if you identified as two-spirit, you were considered holy. Indigenous LGBTQ people were also victims of the white Christian patriarchy. So boarding schools disrupted the promotion of this gender equity, and it was so prominent amongst our people, and they would force our women to adopt the industrial domestic skills appropriate to a European American standard. So going into the goal of residential school, this was by Bishop Vital Grandin in 1875. The goal of residential school is we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. So this process of forced assimilation would cause irreparable psychological trauma to generations of Native American people and their descendants. The goal of this would be done by a total immersion into the white man's world. And with the advent of Native American boarding schools, the assimilation process was fully accelerated through the children, as you can see here. This picture on the right is from Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And just a few slides here of boarding school. The handcuffs on the right on this were from Haskell Indian School. Babies put in handcuffs. This is a cemetery from Carlisle Indian Industrial School where the children who died were buried here. I'm not sure about you, but my school didn't have a graveyard in the back. So, this is kind of the issues that we were facing. So once these children grew up and returned to their home reservations, they would receive a mixed reception from our people. Some would be proud and happy that they were able to attain a white man's education, but this had more to do with distrust of white people in general due to the loss of land and the not honoring of treaties or signing treaties that they didn't understand. So for many, it became a point of survival to learn how to read and write English so as not to be taken advantage of again. Others, on the other hand, would not approve of the attempt to live as a white man or woman. Many students would return home and would become ashamed of their heritage and culture. And so as such, they would find themselves walking between two worlds, oftentimes feeling unaccepted by either. However, still others would return home and completely reject the educational experience and return to the blanket. This was a term that was used to describe an individual that returned to his tribal manners and cultural ways and dress as they cast off the ways of the white man. But still others, they chose to completely immerse in white society and would never return home to their people. Christian missionaries and other persons of good moral character, I say that in parentheses, were charged with civilizing Native children. And this was done through the use of physical and sexual violence. So this became a part of their lived experience. So the impact of historical trauma resulted in these issues of loss of identity, loss of culture, drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues, depression, suicide, difficulty in forming attachments, poverty, health disparities. And so the earlier part of the 20th century was really a time of consolidation and consolidating what little was left of our lands, our language, and our culture. Elders were beaten for speaking their native tongue, which resulted in a reluctancy to teach the children for fear of reprisals. So centuries-old religious societies and ceremonies were lost or buried with our medicine people due to the devastating effects of successive waves of epidemics and diseases. The US government constantly stood like a wolf at the door, ready and willing to abolish our communities forever. And at its worst, even my own Umaha ancestors, they dwindled down to just 300 people. So poverty, death, and disease became a way of life, again, forming the ripple effect that is still felt today. So this is an ancient history. All Native people are survivors of the Indian boarding schools. I am a grandchild of a survivor, a boarding school survivor, and we carry those effects of trauma, survivance, but also resilience within our DNA and blood memory. So just a few statistics, I'll go through these really quickly. Native North American women on the plains are 2.8 times more likely to die before the age of 24. 2.8 times more likely, 2.6 times more likely to commit suicide, or 4.6 times more likely to be murdered, with 62% of the US declining to prosecute cases. Here are some other statistics. I think some of the shocking ones here for me are, on some reservations, the number of sexual violence cases or sexual violence against Native women is committed by non-Native men. Or non-Native people. 4 out of 5 of our Native women are affected by violence. 84% of our Native women have experienced violence. And so 10 times the national average of murder. And so when we think about the population in the United States, we represent less than 2% of the population, yet we are have the highest rates of violence, of poverty, suicide, health inequalities, joblessness, homelessness, drug abuse than any other demographic. And so that's really telling in terms of how much, the policies were designed to exterminate us. Again, some more statistics. Cases were unknown status, 98. 506 MMIW cases were identified across 71 urban cities. These are really important statistics because about 70% of the Indigenous population in the United States actually lives off the reservation. So the majority of our women and girls are living in urban areas. Some of the complex factors that contribute to the structural violence is this jurisdictional maze. So in the states, you will have what's called the federal, state, county, tribal, and local governments. Lisa Murkowski, she is an American lawyer and politician that serves as the senior United States Senator for Alaska. Along with CNN writer Scott McLean and Sarah Westfield, they describe that many women disappear from remote reservations, with many of these remote reservations not even having one single police officer. So other times cases get lost in this confusing web. There's been incidences where police forces were getting out measuring tapes to measure how far over the state line, just to determine jurisdiction over that case or over that investigation. There's also victims, as Murkowski notes, that are simply discounted because of their race, because of who we are as Native individuals, or involvement in sex work. Lack of relationships, communications between governing entities. These, as you'll see further on, so a lot of the legislative policies are designed to close the gap on this between FBI and tribal communication, state and tribal communication. There's also a lack of funding for emergency services, Amber Alert, counseling, family services. And according to this study from the Urban Indian Health Initiative, when they examined the MMIW cases, they found there was a lack of media coverage, that 95% were not covered by national or international news media. So this is just, just to show kind of the complexity. People have law degrees just in Indian law to understand the maze in terms of who has jurisdiction to investigate the crimes. So I'm not going to go into it too much. Obviously you can see here that if the offender is Indian, non-Indian, it goes to federal or child jurisdiction. Here's a jurisdiction flow chart, which actually involves even the Department of Highway and Transportation if a person is trafficked. And then, even the difference on non-public law 83 to 80 states, which is basically, it's just an allocation of criminal jurisdiction in Indian country. So states that are authorized like Alaska, California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, and Wisconsin, they can prosecute crimes that occurred in Indian countries. But these exceptions, they set forth with Public Law 280 that most reservations in those 6 named states, federal criminal jurisdiction became extremely limited while the state jurisdiction was greatly expanded. So these are kind of, these incredible loopholes and gaps that are allowing, with many crimes, they're choosing not to prosecute. Other complex factors that contribute are structural violence, racial misclassification. So in an article from the New York Times, Jack Healy described several reasons why women go unreported. And he describes that women are misclassified as Hispanic or Asian or other racial categories on missing persons forms. And so thousands have been left off the federal missing persons database. And so this misreporting actually leads to an underestimation of the magnitude of this issue. There's a lack of database and tracking to understand the scope. So in 2018, UIHI researched and compiled a database of 5,717 missing Alaska Native and American Indian women and girls. So among those, only 116 were listed on that database that was owned by the Department of Justice. So to counteract that, Anita Lucchese, she serves as the executive director of Sovereign Bodies Institute. I would highly recommend checking this out. She's got a lot of resources, reports, and information that are free to access. And she works as a caretaker for the MMIW database, and she's more recently working with the Department of Justice to consolidate and look through the data that they have to really get an accurate counting of how many are actually missing and murdered. But I like this quote because it's very relevant and topical in terms of the discussion that we're having, that missing and murdered Indigenous people disappear 3 times in life. The erasure happens in the media and in the data. So the US and state responses to violence and MMIWG generally tend to be centered on these themes of domestic violence. Sometimes that, they assume that the girl was drunk or that she went off missing with her friends. There's also a lot of investigations that end up with classification of died of hypothermia rather than homicide. And so missing reports, they're not investigated properly. There's, again, as I said, this inadequate support in the communities. A lot of times it's our own people looking for each other. There's failed reporting of deaths because of this jurisdictional maze, not knowing exactly who has jurisdiction over investigating that. which results in a lack of clarity over prosecution and inadequate efforts. So violence in the land, violence on our bodies. This is a really great resource to have and to have a look at. It was done in partnership with Women's Earth Alliance and Native Youth Sexual Health Network. It's really, it's a really cool toolkit as well, because it kind of talks about how environmental racism or extractive resources impacts the violence that happens to our Native women. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of man camps, particularly around where there are oil pipelines being built. Going along with that violence against the land is violence against the body. In an article for Greenpeace, Caitlin Grable noted that environmentally damaging industries like mining, logging, fossil fuels are some of the largest perpetuating factors of violence, trafficking, and murder. They bring an influx of transient male workers to rural areas, often on reservations where they live in these man camps. So in North Dakota, the back-in oil boom resulted in the arrival of thousands of workers to the area, and this brought a surge in rates of violent crime and aggravated assault. So the state at that time had at least 125 cases of missing Indigenous women. And in reality, though, we know that the numbers are far higher than that, because the data on Indigenous women is often reported incorrectly or not collected at all. So some US initiatives is the Violence Against Women's Act. 1994, VAWA was transferred. 2005 is revised. So currently where we stand in 2021, the House of Representatives have passed the VAWA Reauthorization Act, but we're waiting to have it passed through the Senate, and there's a hope that it will be voted on later this year. Hannah Harris, Hannah's Act. So Hannah was a 21-year-old that went missing from her home on an Indian reservation on Montana on July 4th, 2013. She went out to see fireworks with her friends, but her body was later found on July 8th, and it was so badly decomposed that the crime was actually couldn't be determined, was how it was listed. So because of this, Hannah's Act came about through the Montana state legislature, where police are required to respond immediately, increasing collaborative joint agency working, cultural programs for police, a creation of a missing persons task force. And it was because of the Hannah's Act that May 5th was adopted as that day of National Day of Awareness for MMIW. Savannah Gray Wind. So this law, Savannahs Act, was passed in 2018. It was introduced into the Senate by senators from North Dakota, Alaska, and Nevada, and it was named after Fargo, North Dakota resident Savannah LaFontaine Graywin. She was pregnant at the time of her brutal murder by her non-native neighbors in August 2017. They were a couple that removed the baby from her body, so she was pregnant at this time. Her body was later found in the Red River, which runs along the border of North Dakota and Minnesota. So this river has come to be seen by many in the Indigenous community as a dumping ground for discarded bodies, and their understanding or their sense is that detectives don't take this seriously, this crisis. So they started to, as I said before, look for their own. The loved ones started to drag the red. So they started dragging the river in the hopes of finding other bodies that may have gone missing. And that year, advocates actually pulled out 7 bodies from the river. So Savannah's child, even though she was taken from her during her murder, she was cut out of her belly. Her daughter survived, and she's living with her father. So this was a shocking and brutal crime that needed legislation to control some of this violence that's occurring. Along with that came the Not Invisible Act to address the missing and murdered trafficked Native people. Again, going into kind of that cross agency collaboration It also establishes an advisory committee and designates an official within the Office of Justice Service in the BIA or the Bureau of Indian Affairs to improve violent crime prevention efforts. So this act calls for the Interior Department to coordinate prevention efforts, grants, programs related to missing and murdered Indigenous people. And Secretary Deborah Haaland was the lead sponsor of this act, and the bill was passed unanimously in both chambers of Congress in 2020. Deb Haaland, she's the first Native American cabinet secretary, very proud, figure for many people throughout Indian country. She is the first Native to serve as cabinet secretary. She was confirmed in March 2021, and she's established the formation of a new Missing and Murdered Unit, or MMU, within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is similar to the Not Invisible Act, which we talked about before, to kind of provide that leadership and direction for cross-departmental and interagency work. This will put the full weight of the federal government into investigating these crimes. And she's quoted here saying that violence against Indigenous peoples is a crisis that has been underfunded for decades. Far too often, murders and missing person cases in Indian country go unsolved and unaddressed, leaving families and communities devastated. So this new MMU unit will provide the resources and leadership to prioritize these cases and coordinate resources to hold people accountable, keep our community safe, and provide, sorry, I can't, the screen's in the way, I can't read that last bit, but you get what I'm trying to say, provide closure to families. Okay, so I know that we've been kind of focusing on the USA, and we spent the majority of time speaking on this issue as affecting North America, but I want to highlight how MMIW actually has a broader has broader connotations in terms of British colonialism. So Indigenous history permeates the shores of Britain. I'm sure everyone will be familiar with the story, the Disney story of Pocahontas. Pocahontas was actually a nickname. Her name was actually Mataoaka. And so I put these images up to kind of show the media manipulation that lends itself towards this whitewashed narrative that seems to be more palatable for consumption. So it's really about critically evaluating these histories from a decolonial lens, really looking at this in a way that questions. So we've got at the top the Disney version of John Smith and Pocahontas in love, very romantic notion. They play the romance card. But the reality is that when Pocahontas or Mataoaka met John Smith was 27 years old, and when he met Pocahontas, she was actually, studies say, between 10 and 12 years old at the time. And so the bottom image, Natalie Standing Cloud, has painted an image to kind of counteract that narrative, to show the reality of what really happened with Pocahontas and John Smith. And Pocahontas is actually considered one of the first documented cases of MMIW. And so it really kind of goes into those narratives of Native women either being painted as very hypersexualized or these very submissive maidens in a subjugative pose. And so, we all often speak out about those costumes that kind of have the Pocahontas costumes, which have damaging narratives. And so even though this was a moment in history when two nations were coming together, according to the oral histories of her people, she was actually imprisoned in Jamestown, Virginia, by English colonists who killed her husband. They took her baby from her and then raped her in captivity. And they raped her numerous times, after which she was giving birth, and the child, in captivity, the child of these rapes. And all the while, these captors claimed to be turning her into a civilized Christian woman and rechristened her to Rebecca. She was then trafficked to the shores of England because their colony was not making a profit for their investors, the Virginia Company of London. So they kidnapped her to negotiate with her father for access to more land and better trading rights. So the company later paid. They trafficked her. Actually, I'm not going to say shipped. I'm going to say she was trafficked to England to show potential investors that their investment was a good one, that Indians were not a threat. And as a moral incentive, she was baptized as a Christian, adding souls to heaven. But Pocahontas or Matawaca never returned back home. Colonialism killed Pocahontas, and she was buried in Gravesend, Kent, when she was 21 years old. When her tribe asked for her remains to be repatriated back, the church said they didn't know where she was buried. So how we interact with Indigenous peoples and histories is going to determine social change in the future. MMIWG2ST affects all of us. As we can see, even with Pocahontas, this permeates the shores of Britain, the British colonialism that has contributed to the genocide of Native women. So I pose the question, what are you doing today to create a better tomorrow? Alex, I want to hand this over. I'm going to leave you with this video that is a really powerful video that kind of consolidates sort of the learning and what I was speaking about today. And I think it's really a poignant video to watch. So I'll leave that to you, Alex, to share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leandra. I'm just working on this now. Just bear with me 1 second. Hopefully this will be coming. There we go. So we'll pop that full screen for you all.
For years, people have fought this struggle, fought for our land and water. And I was at a point where I felt like nobody cared. We're just people from here that stood up and asked everybody to come and stand with us. And they did.
Criminals! You guys are criminals! The original pipeline was to go through North Dakota, but it was going through white people's land. So they redirected it, put it through the Indians.
What it all comes down to is wanting clean drinking water for our children.
One family. If we don't stand, who will?
And we are peaceful, prayerful people, but it's come to a point now where enough is enough.
Love is the strongest.
The world is run by corporations now. Who's kidding who? Democracy.
Our prayers would not be needed. Indigenous wisdom unheeded and sacred things depleted.
Are you telling the dogs to bite the protesters?
What is the fossil fuel? Continued destruction, nothing new.
I hear the rubber bullet. I see this one just coming straight for my eye.
Taking our children, shifting their feelings till nothing's true.
How many people know that the United States didn't allow us to raise our own families? We won that right in 1985.
They just put the fear in us so bad with hell and with that belt and with abuse. They'd come after you at night and take you someplace and made you do things you didn't want to do. And you thought it was your fault.
So when people ask, why is this the end of the line? Why are women standing up and saying, no, this is it?
Water is life!
Because they've seen this happen to their children before.
We're disconnected, these times are hectic and feeling.
The earth is not something we pollute, we take advantage of, that we rape. The earth is our mother.
That's why we walk with prayer. And if that wasn't true, we wouldn't be standing here.
Nobody thought any politician would have the guts. And I just closed my eyes and said, do it.
We're still going to pursue the legal avenues. I have to leave a footprint.
People, hold your ground. Change is coming now.
The rhetoric is over. It's time for action.
Thank you, Alex. Wangi de Weebdaha. Thank you, everyone, for listening today.
Thank you again, Leandra. I know there's a huge amount for people to think about there. And one of the things that Leandra and I talked about before doing this session was there's just so much that needed to be put in there. And really, we're only scratching the surface here of the kinds of issues that relate to colonialism, its impact, and issues for Native American communities today. But I hope it gives you something to start thinking about and maybe investigating yourselves. And I know Leandra left that challenge at the end. What are you going to do on the back of that now that you know that? For me, I hope it, we set out with these kinds of aims at the very beginning of this project. And we said we wanted to develop an understanding of US history that went beyond the GCSE. And I hope today has done something to illustrate how important it is to see how, the pre-20th century history or even 20th century US history has a really clear and direct link to issues facing Native American peoples, communities today. But I also hope it's given you the idea that you also need to understand a lot more about how life is for lots of Native Americans in the US today, and how understanding that might make you want to go and find out more about the history, but also it requires us to know a more complete history. It requires us to take away some of those lenses that maybe that history has been viewed through before. And we've talked a lot about the way that we view history, the way we frame history. If we really want to understand how we've ended up in this present, with these issues that we talked about there, with some of the things you've seen in the video about pipelines and land claims and missing and murdered Indigenous women, we need to be able to take a close and hard look at the kinds of history that maybe has been ignored up to this point. And for one, I think the idea of the connections between Britain and what's happened in North America and Canada especially are really key links for us to maybe investigate ourselves as well. It's not something that often comes up when we talk about US history, for example, but I think it is really, really important. Hopefully it's given you some idea as well about the way that history is framed and the way that we construct history, and that I hope will help underpin some of the further study you might do in history. Whether you go on just to study it for A level, whether you're doing personal study, whether you're going on to study it at degree level, maybe it's the beginning of some of that understanding that will help you pursue history more deeply. And obviously we've talked about lots of these injustices that have come through as well. On the back of this, then, there are several things I'm going to kind of say here. The first one is there are some challenges in the packs that I sent out to teachers to look at contemporary issues. So one of the things that I've asked people to maybe have a look at is researching a contemporary issue for a Native American tribe today and looking at its historic roots and really taking that hard look at where is the history that's brought us to this point. There are some fantastic stories on Indian Country Today, which is an online newspaper which looks at stories from right across the US and beyond as well. But actually, there's a whole range of suggestions that you might want to look into, whether it's to do with fishing rights, or whether it's to do with the purchase of casinos, for example, or whether it's to do with missing and murdered Indigenous women or pipelines or any of these other issues that we've talked about here. You might also want to deepen your knowledge of the historiography of 19th century US history. And there is a task I've set you in there if you'd like to do it, comparing and contrasting 3 different takes on Native American resistance to settler colonialism in the 1960s and 1970s, for instance, which I think is a really interesting experience when you compare what's being said by different authors. And again, that's a really good preparation for the kinds of thinking you might need to do at A level and beyond. But also, I hope that, again, you take up Leandra's challenge and become an active voice in educating other people about the realities of continued Indigenous presence in the United States today. There is a wonderful project in the UK called Beyond the Spectacle, which you can search on Google and get access to, which does look at Indigenous presence in the UK. But also, if you want to think about beyond that, what kinds of work could you do? Well, actually, one of the things that you might do is go back and have a look at your exam board specification, go back and have a look at your textbook, maybe write to those companies. That's quite an interesting thing to do, but it also shows companies, exam boards, textbook authors, textbook companies, that people are interested in getting this right and improving the way that we present this history. And you might also want to just develop your own knowledge and your own understanding. I love this phrase, and it comes from a colleague who did one of these previous sessions for me, and she talked about teaching US history and finding that when she taught history in the US, there was a real absence of Indigenous presence there. And in the end, she said, I just had to go away and research and find out for myself. And she talks about taking your frustration and channeling it into learning. And I love that idea that you might find that there are real absences, there are real gaps in the way that we understand history. And if we take the frustrations we have with that and we channel it into learning, we can have a positive impact. So, go and talk about this with people, go and find out more about it and share it. I think that would be a really good use of that time. So I'm not going to go on too much longer here. I'm going to wrap up, but I am going to say, for the benefit of anybody watching this, whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching this on catch up, I'm going to be sending around a few things. First of all, a follow-up survey. I would really appreciate it if you could fill that in, teachers especially. It's just really to see how many people have accessed this and to see whether or not, because this is a pilot, we've never done one of these specifically aimed at students before. It's a bit of a pilot. We'd love to know how it's worked, what's worked well, what's not worked, and whether there's scope for doing something like this, a similar thing in the future on other topics. There will also be a link there to donations. We've offered this for free, and we really wanted to offer it for free because we thought it was important that it's got out a wide as message as possible. But equally, if you are able to and would like to donate and support the work that we've done here and support future work we might do here, that would be hugely appreciated. Even if it's only £1, £2, would really just help go towards allowing us to do this again, and some links will come out for that. And of course, do stay in touch. So if you want to find out more about what we're doing at SHP, or more about US history, Indigenous history, please follow at 1972 SHP on Twitter and let us know what you're getting up to. So if you go away and do some more research on the back of this, or you get involved in some of those tasks, maybe you do a presentation for your school on something, I don't know, share it with us and let us know what you got up to. That would be really fantastic. I'm just going to say thank you ever so much to everybody who's come along to this and everybody who's supported this. I really hope it's been useful. I really hope it's been helpful and that you've got something from it. And I look forward to maybe seeing some of you again in the future if we run more sessions like this. Thank you ever so much.